So as you can see, it's a strong contender for the most black and white talk in the or presentation in this school. But I'm a physicist. I'm a hobbit, elf, an elf. Okay, so maybe I thought the physicists were the hobbits, but not, okay. Okay, so let's see if I can. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about self-sustained activity and an attempt to model it. And self-sustained activity is one of the many patterns, activity patterns that one find in the brain when studied using different methods. And it can be defined as, well, by the way, it's also known as spontaneous or ongoing activity. It depends on the field you work with. But it's defined as the firing of neurons measured in the absence of sensory stimuli or behavioral tasks, which is also known as the resting state. So if you're asleep at your bed, or if you're under anesthesia, or if you're in coma, or if you're just absent-minded or absent from any input from the environment and just absorbed in your thoughts, you're close to what people call resting state. And even in the situation in which the brain or the cortex is not submitted to external input, there's some activity, some firing activity in the brain. And the problem is to try to understand the mechanism behind this state. Why is it important to understand, to grasp this self-sustained activity? By the way, I'm going to call it SSA for short. Well, this ongoing activity that is always present in the brain, it sets a state of the brain which interacts with the external stimuli. So if at this moment if at some point I'm at this resting state and then some external stimulus happens, we will interact with the current state of the brain, and the response, the evocative response of the brain to this stimulus will be shaped, so to speak, by the external stimulus. It also, it's important because, for a second reason for why it's important, is that it seems that the types of responses that the brain or the cortex does when it's stimulated with external stimuli are similar to the patterns that are observed during this sustained states, which suggests that the sustained states, SSA states, are sort of repertoire of states that act as attractors. When one receives an external stimulus, the brain state converges to one of these attractors. So this is a possibility, so another importance for studying it. And thirdly, it's a state that is with us for life. So we have this state which is very stable and robust throughout our entire life. I don't know if you can read here at the back, but that's what it said there. There's as was previously said this morning, and I suppose in other talks in this school, this self-sustained state is not. It looks like noise, but it's not noise. It's irregular, but not noise. There are several evidence pointing to that. So you can see here I just put two papers which just start by saying that ongoing cortical activity is far from being just noise. The traditional view of spontaneous neuroactivity as noise has been challenged by recent findings, which means that there's this resting state, this ongoing state, has some features of noise, but it's not noise. It looks like noise, but it's not noise. So we cannot just model it or assume it as just being noise. So if it's not noise, how it looks like? So that some typical signatures of cortical SSA, self-sustained states, are summarized here in these two slides here. This one and the next one. So we have neurons with low firing rates, which is a signature of the normal brain state as well. So if you have here the distribution of spontaneous firing of neurons in the cortex, this is data from the auditory cortex. The paper is there. One sees this sort of distribution. Notice that most of the firing rates are concentrated in this low firing rate range here, below 20 hertz, although there are some neurons that fire at higher rates. If you do a log plot if you plot the log of the fine rate as the fine rate, one has a curve that looks like Gaussian. So this suggests that the fine rate is log normal, or it's non-Gaussian. That's for sure, but it could be fit by a log normal distribution. What's important is that it's a non-Gaussian distribution. Another feature is this irregularity. Sorry? Yeah. No. I mean, in this particular paper, they fit by a log normal, but I'm not saying that it's always a log normal. Yeah. So I have no idea. So it's non-Gaussian. Let's assume that. Okay. Yeah. So I was saying it's also irregular. So one can characterize the irregularity of neurospiking using the interspike interval histogram. So I assume that you all know what's the interspike interval. It's interval between spikes of a given neuron. So if you do a distribution of the EASY or ISI intervals and make this histogram, you see that they have this typical shape here, which is also non-Gaussian with a sort of exponential tail there. It has a broad distribution and sort of exponential tail, which looks like Poissonian. That's why it's noisy, but it's not entirely noise. So this is another feature of the spiking that has to be captured by any model that tries to reproduce spontaneous activity. So here also showing that this irregular finding happens in anesthetized and awake situations in an animal. I don't know which one. By the way, if you are interested, every paper I quote here, it's in my computer, so I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but at least you can take it from me to read or study afterwards. All this data raises a lot of questions, and the ones that strike me are the ones I put here. What are the mechanisms responsible for the existence of this spiking activity in the cortex without external stimuli? What are the mechanisms behind it? Though these mechanisms depend on the structural organization of cortical connections, which means the topology of the architecture of the cortex. Do they depend on the intrinsic characteristics of cortical neurons? So different neurons have different behaviors, different electrophysiological behaviors. Do these behaviors affect or determine the kind of the type of global activity that the network exhibits? And what are the mechanisms that make the cortical sustained activity irregular but not random? What are the mechanisms behind it? So these are the big questions that I'm supposed to try to attempt to obtain some insights on the basic mechanisms responsible for them. This is still an open subject, an open problem. So this is what I call classical hypothesis. Classical in the sense that they were talking about neuroscience, which is a new subject. Not classical in the sense of mathematics or physics. It's classical in the sense that it was proposed in 1996. For neuroscience, it's kind of old. And it's also classical in the sense that many people use it. Many people explain the irregularity found in the cortex and the sustained activity using this proposal, which was the earliest I found was Sompolinski's paper with his collaborator Van Vreeswijk. So the idea is that the cortex operates at a balanced state in which the average activity that excitatory neurons, the average input that excitatory neurons receive from other neurons in the system and from the external world balances more or less exactly the inhibitory input that these neurons receive, so that they sort of cancel each other, like shown here in this graph from this paper. So the total excitatory input to a given neuron in the system is lying over here. The total inhibitory input that this neuron receives is lying over there. So when you add them together, you get some average input that is close to threshold. And sometimes it's above threshold, sometimes it's not above threshold. So the mean input is close to 0, but the fluctuations that lead the system sometimes up, sometimes down, are the ones that regulate the firing. So the system is really regulated or controlled by the fluctuations. The fluctuations are the ones that determine, are the process behind this irregularity. So this explains irregular spiking, the noise-like behavior of the neurons, and also the sustained activity, because this prevents the system to converge neither to the, say, epileptic state in which all neurons are firing, or to the resting state, or let's not use the resting state here, but to the zero state, or the state where all neurons are in the resting state. It's difficult to not use this. I'm trying not to confuse resting state, as I said before, to resting state of the neurons, but I suppose you understand the meaning. So this is the classical hypothesis. It was proposed theoretically in this paper in 1996. There's also a classical model. I call it classical model because also it's a kind of old model proposed in 2000 by Nicolas Brunel in France. It's now in Chicago. And it's also classical in the sense that many people use this. Many people use this model as simply a model for the cortex. So it's a random network. So you just have a bunch of n neurons randomly connected with some probability. Everybody uses this ratio here, which was, mentioned before in the other talks in the school. 80% of the neurons are excitatory, 20% of the neurons are inhibitory. There's sparse connectivity, which is also experimentally known. So the number of connections received by a given neuron is much smaller than the number of neurons. So each neuron receives a much smaller number of synapses from the network than the number of neurons, which sort of decorrelates the behavior of the neurons. This is important for the hypothesis proposed for this classical hypothesis. I won't have time here, and I think this is not the purpose to say digging deeply into this model, but as I said, you can read the papers afterwards. The type of neurons that I use in the classical model are integrate and fire neurons. I suppose most of you, or some of you, perhaps the elves know what an integrate and fire neuron is. I don't know if the hobbits know as well. I'll have a short slide on them afterwards. So, but this is a very simplified neural model, probably the most simple neural model that one can find. So it's a kind of favorite toy neural model used by theoreticians. It's quite, since I'm not going to talk 2 hours, I can give some side comments. It's really funny because I think this, I made my career not on integrated fire neurons. For the ones who know me know that I usually do realistic modeling, what people call realistic modeling, which is Hodgkin-Huxley type models, which are very detailed, biophysically detailed models. And so this is somewhat new for me. And once I was attending a conference on realistic modeling organized by Jim Barrow, people who know him, Jim Bauer, people who know him know that he's really against this kind of modeling. And he made us swear an oath in that conference that we should never either teach or talk on integrate and fire neural model to students. And I'm doing just against it now. But I think it's worthwhile. It's interesting to use this model because it's really simple. So, and this is why I call classical, because really a lot of researchers use them. So in this model, which is simple enough to be studied analytically via mean field approximations, and also to be simulated, the conditions for the existence of self-sustained activity are the following. The inhibitory synapses have to be stronger than the excitatory synapses, and it's quite simple to understand that because of the number of inhibitory neurons is much smaller than the number of excitatory neurons, so the synapses that they provide have to be stronger than synapses provided by the excitatory neurons. And quite oddly, the external, it's necessary to have an external stimulus applied constantly to the system, which goes against the idea of sustained activity without existence of external stimulus. So it's a sort of contradictory argument, and that's why many people don't like this model, because it requires external stimulus. And also it shows how hard it is to find a model, to construct a model that can generate sustained activity that's long-lived. There are other proposals that I don't mention here, which use endogenously firing neurons, specific types of neurons that respond to inhibition. So people try to come up with different models, but it's really difficult to find a model that can generate sustained activity which is long-lived. So without the external stimulus, this model sustains activity only for a limited time. So you can read all the detail. It's a good exercise. I mean, it's something that people in a school like this could, say, take the paper and try to work out all the maths. It could be possibly done in a week time, at least for the elves among you. Sorry? Oh, it uses mean field. It's a mathematical paper. It uses mean field approximation, so it's not a rigorous, but it's... Okay, it's a third one. It's not... a mathematician is a... Oh, kind of... It's above God. Yeah, it's something else. Oh, yeah, Siddhartha should name a category for mathematicians. Well, this is from that paper, by the way. So, so they, in their mathematical study, they provide a kind of diagram of all the behaviors that are found in this network model made of integrated fire neurons. So you have a so-called epileptic or synchronous and regular network behavior. You have also synchronous and irregular behavior. You have synchronous irregular with low oscillatory period, and asynchronous irregular, which is the most interesting one, which is the most similar to this default, to this ongoing state, the self-sustained state of the brain. You notice that it really requires the existence of stronger inhibition in comparison to excitation, and also it requires external stimulus. So the idea now is to try to go beyond these classical models, as we scientists like to do. We try to, say, push models beyond the present state to see what can we do to improve the models. And to do this, usually one has to add more details and more complications into the model, which has a side effect that it ends up turning the models less analytically treatable by mathematicians. But I'm a physicist, so, or I'm a neuroscientist now, so perhaps one can study or simulate this kind of model and try to obtain some insight. Yeah, I used to be a physicist. Now I'm more a neuroscientist, or I don't know. I'm in this borderline between. Yeah, long live. Yeah, so I think one of my points of view about this, I mean, why do your theory on something that you cannot, say, understand in such a precise way as a mathematician does? Because I think, I mean, as a scientist, I think it's important to use, say, whatever model you have to obtain insights that can be useful to experimentalists, to people who work on the field, to put their hands on the field and obtain. Yeah, it's an old discussion. I don't want to. Yeah. I'm just since this is school, I think it's interesting also to express points of view. So this can, I mean, can be pondered by students either where they are against or for these points of view. So the idea is to go beyond the classical models, and the proposal here is to use more realistic architectures and more realistic neural models. So attack into using the two different sides of the problem. So why to use different neural models? Because basically neurons are not integrated fire devices. Neurons have different personalities. Neurons have different firing behaviors. Neurons can be classified in many different ways, based on morphology, based on the type of neurotransmitter they release, based on the number of spines they have. And one of them, the most, say, classic one, is the electrophysiological class to which they belong to. And usually people say that there are 5 main electrophysiological categories or classes into which neurons can be classified, which are regular spiking. You can see here, so they, after an accommodation period, they start firing regularly, tack, 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 tack. Intrinsically bursting, which is this one, they spike into bursts of tack, 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 tack. Sometimes they miss some bursts. What people call chattering, fast repetitive bursting, which is this one here, which is more like trrr, 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 trrr. So it's really fast and repetitive. Those three are excitatory neurons, so they are glutamatergic neurons. They release glutamate as a main neurotransmitter. And there's fast spiking neurons, which are very fast. They are here, so they have tack, 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 but not bursts. They don't send. And there's also neurons called low threshold spike-producing neurons, which are not shown here, but they have the feature that they produce spikes when they're stimulated below the usual threshold of spiking of other neurons. And also, if you inhibit those neurons, they have a spike produced afterwards, inhibitory rebound spike. So they have a peculiar nature. And those last two, the FS and LTS neurons, I'm going to refer to them by the acronyms, are inhibitory neurons. They are GABAergic neurons. So the idea is to try to incorporate this knowledge into the model. And how can we do that? Well, the ideal thing would be to take, say, the most realistic type of model that can be constructed, which is a Hodgkin-Huxley type of model. It's a really a biophysical model with all the details using also not only Hodgkin-Huxley's approach, but also cable theory. So the idea would be to construct neural models with geometry, with morphology, with all the details that are necessary to generate behavior. As Rodrigo said this morning, those features are not, say, given to the neuron. They are generated by the biophysics of the neuron. So if you want to reproduce it, a possible way is to reconstruct the biophysics. So to do that, one need to know the morphology, one need to know the membrane capacitance, the membrane resistance, the density of the maximal densities of the many ion channels, the ion channel conductances present in the membrane and the different parts of the neuron. So it's really complicated. You really need a lot of data. Usually they are not available. And now, even if they are available, the implementation cost is prohibitive. Although with current fast computers that one has now, they're becoming more and more possible to be implemented. But on the other extreme, one has the integrated fire neuron, which is, as I said, the simplest type of neuron that one can get. It's very efficient to be implemented computationally, but also is the most unrealistic type of model. So ideally, one would try to get a model which is in between them. And there are many different models. They are plotted here in this qualitative graph prepared by Izhikevich. And one of the models that pops up as a good compromise is Izhikevich's own model, which was proposed in 2003, because it lies more or less here. It's efficient computationally, and it's also plausible in terms of biology. Not in terms of morphology, in terms of all this biophysics. This is not a biophysical model, but it at least it's a model that captures the firing behavior. It can reproduce all the firing behaviors known with few equations. So it's in a sense, it's better than integrated fire. And it's cheap. So it's a good compromise. And it's becoming classical because I've been noticing that many researchers, many modelers are using this model now as a sort of alternative to a Hodgkin-Huxley type model. An example is myself. Although I still use Hodgkin-Huxley because I like them. Well, so I talked about integrated fire. So here it is, I mean, in a very simple slide. So it basically, I don't know whether you had in this school some talk on the Hodgkin-Huxley approach on neuromodeling, but I mean, the idea is you can model the membrane, or the neural membrane, as an RC circuit. So you have a capacitive term there, which models the membrane capacitance, and you have a resistive current there that models the fact that neuron has channels, which are governed by the conductance of the channel. And in this case, one assumes that the conductance is passive, so it doesn't act, it doesn't react to differences in concentration or voltage around the neuron. It's simply a leakage conductance. And there's also an injected current, and all of them have to add together. So it's a simple RC circuit. So one can call RC the time constant of the circuit, and one can rearrange the equation, can redefine some variables, and obtain a quite simple equation like this one, which generates a subthreshold behavior, just an exponentially growing behavior towards an asymptote. This is for a constant stimulus. Okay, so as simulated here. Here one has two different stimulus, two different stimuli, one in black, one in red. One in black is below threshold. One sets a threshold for the model, so the model cannot generate a spike. The spike is generated by hand. When the voltage reaches threshold, you say a spike was emitted. So you put the spike there by hand. If the model doesn't reach threshold, it stays, it reaches this asymptote and stays there. But wherever it reaches threshold, you have a spike. And after the spike, what happens? You reset the model, not to the resting potential, which is E, but to a reset potential, which is VR, above V. And from there, this thing starts evolving again. One can add, if one wants, a refractory period, which is a delay during which the neuron basically does nothing and wait for the end of this time to start growing again. So this is the integrated fire model. As you see, it's very simple. It generates a stereotyped behavior for a constant input. If you apply irregular input, it generates input that reflects this irregularity, but it doesn't have means to generate all the different behaviors observed in neurons, in real neurons. This is Izhikevich's model. The ones who are interested in knowing more about it can check his webpage or read this book, the book that he wrote. Unfortunately, it's out of range here. You can find it. You can find many pirate copies of it in the internet as well, if you want. Although I didn't say this. So using basically two equations, an equation that models the voltage, membrane voltage, and an equation for a generic variable which models a slow adaptive variable, one can generate all these kinds of behaviors that are shown here. So tonic spiking, phasic spiking, tonic bursting, phasic bursting, and so on. So, and to do that, you basically need to set values for four parameters. A, B, C, and D. So if you just those four parameters, you can reproduce, you can mimic the firing behavior of basically any neuron you can find. This is not the only model that can do that. There are models called made-to-order neurons, or neuron models that also can do that. They are basically generalizations of the integrated fire. They are quadratic integrated fire, exponential integrated fire. There's a whole family of simple models that can generate any type of spiking behavior you want. There's even a contest. I don't know if you know that. This International Neuroinformatics Coordinating Facility has a yearly contest. They provide lots of spikes provided, a time series of spikes provided by unknown neurons, and they challenge modelers to try to construct a model that can reproduce the spikes. This contest has been won since the beginning by a Japanese group who works on one of those alternative simple models. They can fit exactly the spike timing of any time series that you want. By the way, realistic models never enter this contest because how can you model a time series without knowing the neuron, without knowing the morphology and all the details of the neuron? But anyway, you can model the time series in a way that can be useful. So the idea is to use Izhikevich's model to reproduce the 5 main cortical electrophysiological classes described, and couple this with a model which has a more realistic architecture than just random. And there are many evidence. I don't provide them here, but you can say search in the internet. There are many evidence showing that the architecture of the cortex, at least on a large scale, is hierarchical and modular. So it's based on modules. And if you go modules upon modules, modules up on top of modules in a hierarchical way. So there's a module here, there's another module there, but there's another, say, upper module that congregates us and into a larger module, and this larger module is part of a larger module, and so on, in a hierarchical way. So as I say our model. From now on, I'll be referring to we, or us, because this is part of this paper that has just been accepted to be published in Frontiers of Computational Neuroscience, so you can see it, say, in some months. Sorry? Yeah. But by the way, this is not part of Neuromat. It's part of another collaboration, but maybe in the future part of Neuromat. So since this is cool, I'll try to say go into the details of the model construction. So I'll describe, say, in a succinct way the model parts. Neurons, synapses, and the network. So neurons, as I told you before, neurons are modeled by Izhikevich's equation. So Johan has the two equations with 4 parameters. The 4 parameters are set. This was done not by us, by Izhikevich himself. He did that long ago in the early 00s of this millennium. So by adjusting the models, one can reproduce the firing behavior of the 5 main electrophysiological classes: regular spiking, intrinsically bursting, chattering, which are the excitatory ones; fast spiking, low threshold spikes. Okay, so these are you can compare this time series with real time series from real neurons and see that they look like. It's difficult to distinguish. You can ask an experimentalist; they say, "Wow, they really look like." Say, spiking profiles of those 5 neuron classes. Synapses. Well, synapses are modeled using the usual equation, conductance-based equation, to model synapses. So you have a synaptic current, which is modeled as any current in the Hodgkin-Huxley way. The thing is that the dynamics of the synapse is not modeled in a Hodgkin-Huxley way. It's modeled in a much simpler way, which is called event-driven without delay. So we don't have delays in this model. One can introduce delays. So when after a presynaptic neuron fires, there's a, say, short time until the signal gets to the postsynaptic neuron, then it reacts to this signal. In our case, in this current case, we don't have delays. So the idea is that at any time the presynaptic neuron fires, there's an increment. The synaptic conductance of this I to J synapse is incremented by a constant factor, which has a different value for excitatory synapses and inhibitory synapses. This term here for the elves among you means nothing but to say that at time t, there's a spike from the presynaptic neuron. So at any time that the presynaptic neuron fires, you just add a constant increment to the synaptic conductance. After that, synaptic conductance decays exponentially. So you just make the synaptic conductance jump to a given value, and then it decays exponentially. Here, I don't know if you can see that, is an example when the red excites the blue. So 2 neurons coupled by this synapse. So the red is firing, it starts exciting the blue, so the blue starts firing. This is the voltage, this is the conductance. See that the conductance are incremented by fixed amounts. A fixed amount for the red ones and a fixed amount for the blue ones. After a while, the inhibitory neuron starts firing, and then it inhibits the excitatory neuron, which starts firing with a longer interspike interval. So they interact and they generate their dynamics. So this is also a classic model in a sense. It's used by many modelers. So in a sense, there's nothing really new in this model. And now the hierarchical modular network that we're using. There are many possible ways of constructing a hierarchical modular network. We're using this top-down method, so-called top-down method, proposed by Wang et al. Some years ago. The idea of top-down is because we constructed in a top-down way, as you can see if you go through, if you follow me in the description. So the idea is one has several hierarchical levels, which are indexed by letter H. And for each hierarchical level H, one has 2 to 8 modules. So hierarchical level 0 has 1 module. Hierarchical level 1 has 2 modules. Hierarchical level 3 has 4 modules, and so on. Neurons are also divided or separated into 2 different types, excitatory and inhibitory. 80% of them are excitatory, 20% are inhibitory. And we start at the top level, which is hierarchical level 0, one single module. And this single module is just a random network, or a Erdős-Rényi network, in which we connect neuron pairs with probability p. So one defines a probability p, get a neuron pair, and generate a random number, and see if between, say, 0 and 1, if the number gets into the value from 0 to p, you set a connection, otherwise you don't set and go for another neuron pair. To go to higher levels, higher H level, how do we do? We divide the module into two. So two, perhaps, could be better if I draw here, no? When start with a single module, let's use this representation here, and then we divide into two. Inside the single module, I'm going to use blue for excitatory couplings and red for inhibitory. So one has some excitatory couplings inside each module because of the random network that existed before, some inhibitory couplings here inside each module, but also there's some inhibitory couplings connecting neurons from different modules, as well as excitatory couplings, because you started from the random network. The idea is to rewire the network so as to have only to have intermodular connections exclusively excitatory. So this is a summary of what is written there. So for any inhibitory coupling linking two different modules, one deletes this connection and establish a new one connecting, say, this neuron here, which was sending the inhibitory coupling to the other module, to another randomly chosen neuron in the same module. Okay, so for every inhibitory coupling that connects, every intermodular inhibitory coupling, one deletes the inhibitory coupling and generates another one inside the module. And for the excitatory ones, one does the same, but with a small probability of preserving the intermodular coupling. So 10%. So 10% of these intermodular couplings are preserved. So 0.1 are rewired. Yeah, 10% are preserved. Okay. Yeah. 0.1. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 0.9 and 0.1. Okay. 0.1 of preserving, that's the probability, yeah, of preserving the connection. So most of them will be rewired inside, but a few of them will still exist. So this mechanism will render intermodular connections exclusively excitatory, and will create denser connections inside each module. The composition of the network is the following. So use the excitatory neurons, which are 80%, can be either purely regular, so all of them regular spike neurons, or a mixture of two types, regular spikes, which are always present, and either chattering, which are the bursty neurons, or the intrinsically bursty neurons. So one has two possible scenarios for the excitatory neurons. Either all of them are regular spiking, or they are a mixture of two types. We didn't consider three types because it would be too complicated at this first step. And the inhibitory neurons are either of one class or the other. So we didn't consider mixtures of inhibitory neurons. All of them are fast spiking or low threshold spikes. We also did lots of activity measures. Here's just a definition of them, so probably I shouldn't go through this. So we use, say, the mean firing rate of neurons over time, t, the activity of the network over time, delta t, which is fixed in 1 millisecond, the firing rate of the network. So these are the measures that we use. And also we use irregularity measures, which are basically the interspike interval, the distribution of the interspike intervals, and also the coefficient of variation of the interspike intervals of all neuron time series, and the distribution of these coefficient of variations. How to activate the neuron? So to remember, we're trying to study self-sustained activity. Self-sustained activity is a state in which the network doesn't receive external stimuli. So the idea is to put the network at a given state and then let it evolve freely without receiving any stimuli. We could do that by hand. We could just say, in the high-dimensional phase space of the system, set an initial condition at some point, and then let the system evolve from that point onwards. But instead of doing that, we did what most people do. We stimulated the system for a short time period, just awaken it, to put it in a sort of physiologically plausible initial state. So instead of putting by hand, we stimulated all the neurons at the network by a certain current with a given value, I stim. All the neurons, or a proportion of them, in some cases we stimulated, say, half of them, or 1/3 or 1/4 of the neurons, for a given time, t stim, which is the time of the stimulation. And after that, we let the system evolve freely until the end of the simulation. And then we studied the existence of self-sustained activity in terms of the hierarchical level, H equals 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on, the composition of the network and synaptic strengths, which are the strengths of those increments. We did a preliminary study just to find our way in this high-dimensional phase space. So we used a small network made of 512 neurons with p equals to 0.02. And we considered a large region of synaptic strengths. Large because this is much larger than say, people who work on the random model use. But still, the range of inhibitory strengths is larger than the range of excitatory strengths, which is the, say, time-honored idea of the classical model, which we're trying to preserve here. And also use the discretization step, which is kind of coarse, gives a coarse measure of the behavior. And so this is an idea of this phase space, what we call space of strong synaptic strengths, the inhibitory strengths and the excitatory strengths. And in this diagram, we studied all possible network configurations. So 3 different hierarchical levels, H equals 0, 1, 2. So this is a single module, this is 2 modules, this is 4 modules, and all the compositions in terms of combinations of neurons. The first excitatory neuron is always regular spiking. The second excitatory neuron could be IB or CH, intrinsically bursting or chattering, and the inhibitory neuron could be LTS or LFS. So we studied all these 4 different architectures under different initial conditions to determine the duration of sustained activity, the duration of activity in the network after the end of the external stimulation. What we found, first of all, is the types of patterns that are exhibited by these networks. We observed only 4. Four types of patterns, which are illustrated here. These are 4 examples, 4 instances of the many that we simulated, but the general characteristics are presented here. So one of them is what we call constant self-sustained activity, which is a state in which, it's a highly irregular state in which, say, the activity of the neurons remains more or less constant. The firing rate of the network remains more or less constant with very high values. There's another self-sustained activity state which we call persistent oscillatory, in which persistent because it is sustained, in which neurons oscillate in a sort of more synchronous way, although still there's some irregularity in the behavior. One has here the raster and here the firing rate. And there are two types of patterns which are not sustained for long times. The first one is the same type of pattern of the persistent oscillatory SSA, but without SSA. So they decay to resting state after a while. And there's a decaying state in which the systems continuously decay towards resting. So these are the 4 types of patterns that we observed in our simulation. Compare them to the ones that I presented before, which were obtained by Brunel in his classic work on the random network. They're not exactly the same. That's why we decided to use our own terminology, because the model is different.
What changes from one situation to the other one? As the rate or what?
What changes? The duration of the activity.
I mean, what's the difference between the systems which have these 4 different?
These are. We have in this diagram here of synaptic strengths, we simulated all possible network architectures with different initial conditions. In some of them, No, not only the initial condition, but the architecture as well. Yeah. So these are just the for all possible architectures and all possible initial conditions, we could classify all the behaviors that we found into only 4 types. More or less these 4 types. So what? Yeah, I mean, yeah. Mm-hmm. So here, the first state, this state here, is this point A here in this diagram. So it is this green region here corresponds to constant self-sustained activity. So all types of this general behavior. This is for modular. This for hierarchical level 1, which is a network of two modules. 60% of the excitatory neurons are regular, spiking, 20% chattering, 20% low threshold spiking. The activation parameters, which are the parameters that set the initial conditions, 1 as the probability of stimulation, so 100% of the cells receive current before the end of external stimulation. This current is 20 in the arbitrary units of the model, and the stimulation was 80 milliseconds. So after that, all of them, those neurons here, had this constant SSA behavior. Some of them had persistent oscillatory behavior, the red ones here, and the ones in yellow and blue are the ones which decay, which are not sustained. The problem with these graphs here is that if you look at the firing rates, this is a diagram of the mean firing rate of neurons. You see that in most of the cases here, the firing rates are unrealistically high. They're too high for a brain, for a cortex, for a real cortex. They are 50, 100, 150 hertz. I don't know, if you present this to a neuroscientist, I don't know what you as a neuroscientist say. Would this be a good model for the cortex, a model which can have 150 hertz? I mean, usually a cortex in a sustained state, in a state in a resting state without receiving any input, a non-epileptic one, doesn't have this mean firing rate. Of course, I mean, I understand that from a mathematical point of view, it's interesting because all those states are sustained, but they're unrealistic. So that's why we decided to work on this this small region of the parameter space, the parameters are Gx and Gin, to see if in that region one has more realistic firing rates. But from these preliminary results, I mean, from the many analyses we did, because this is just for one architecture. As I said, we run simulations for all the architectures of many different initial conditions. A summary of our main findings is that if you increase the hierarchical level, which means if you increase the number of modules, the area in that diagram corresponding to self-sustained activity increases, which sort of suggests that modularity favors self-sustained activity. So if you have more modules in your brain, the probability of have self-sustained activity or long duration self-sustained activity is larger. If you introduce a second excitatory neuron in your model, and the second excitatory neuron is of the chattering type, the one that that does like that, you also increase the area corresponding to self-sustained activity, which is suggesting that, heterogeneity in the network, especially in terms of the composition of excitatory neurons, also favors self-sustained activity. If the concerning the inhibitory neuron, if you replace the intrinsically, I mean, sorry again, this is also on the excitatory neurons. If the excitatory neurons are of the intrinsically bursting type, their introduction and the variation in their percentages doesn't seem to generate any alteration, any visible alteration on the area of self-sustained activity. So in this, say, preliminary results, or in this, say, poor type of model that we're using, the presence of this type of neuron doesn't favor SSA. And regarding the inhibitory neurons, if we use LTS neurons instead of FS neurons, this also favors self-sustained activity. So the main factors that increase the likelihood of having self-sustained activity in this, say, small model that we use, modularity, presence of excitatory neurons of CH type together with RS, which are the dominant type of excitatory neurons, and presence of low threshold spiking neurons in the model. This is the prediction, and that's what models are good for. Models are really toy models, really toy instruments that one can use to predict things that people can test and do workbench. Experimentalists can try, say, to see if this corresponds to realistic situations. A more detailed study, which is the same kind of study, using a larger network with a smaller probability of connection between neurons. So I don't know if this would generate we could try, okay, try a smaller, yeah, a smaller p, okay? Yeah, okay. Okay, so, but, I mean, we did, I mean, if you go through the paper, you find these values, I mean, this. And then, in this case, we simulated over a longer simulation time. And what we found, so this is the same diagram, but this is I think it's better to present here. So this is a small piece of that diagram, which we call weaker, diagram of weak synaptic strength. So the inhibitory strengths go up to 1, and the excitatory go up to only 0.15, but smaller. And we use a smaller discretization step, so we had a finer grain analysis. And what we found is that highly fragmented structure of the type of behavior that one has. The colors here correspond to the same colors here. So green is constant, self-sustained activity. Red is persistent, oscillatory, self-sustained activity. And the other ones are the ones who are not self-sustained. Notice that there's no green here. So we didn't find any persistent self-sustained state in this regime. This regime with low synaptic strengths, we only found oscillatory self-sustained activity. So oscillations that states which are sustained but oscillate. But the striking fact is that the presence of this diagram is highly fragmented. And you can find most of them are concentrated on the upper right corner, but there are some sustained states even in this for very low synaptic strengths. And also, the configuration of this diagram is highly sensitive to the initial conditions. If you change the initial conditions just by a tiny bit, so if you simulate the system instead of by if the time systems instead of 199, or if you present the stimulus not to half, 3/4, 10, or the intensity of the stimulus is something a little, say, higher or lower than that range, you completely alter this diagram. So if you start at a point here, and also if you change the coupling strengths, Gx and Gi, by small values, you change the behavior of this system. So systems that have this kind of behavior, which strongly depend on the initial conditions, are known in the literature, in mathematical literature, as chaotic systems. So this suggests that we have a chaotic regime in this situation. But of course, since the system dies out after a certain state, after a certain time, it's not an attractor in a mathematical sense, but can be say, a long or short transient, long or short chaotic transient. And this kind of behavior are known in the literature as transiently chaotic. So what we're showing here is that this self-sustained oscillatory state is a transiently chaotic state, at least in our model, which is very difficult to be say, studied in a mathematical sense because of the high dimensionality of the system. And also makes difficult our study because a transient, by definition, a sustained state is something that lasts forever. But we're showing here that there's no state that lasts indefinitely. What we have here, what we have found in our model is only transient. But we still keep calling transient self-sustained activity state. But it makes it difficult for us to classify which states are self-sustained, which states are not self-sustained, because it's difficult to draw in this sharp boundary between states. So the best we can do is to find the probability of having self-sustained activity with a given lifetime. So a given state can last for a certain time, another state very close by can last for a slightly longer time, some other state very close by can last for a slightly shorter time. It's difficult. It's impossible to predict. We cannot predict the duration of the system, but we can predict. We can study the probability of having self-sustained activity with a given lifetime. So, but also to determine this probability, one has to study a lot of possible states. All the initial conditions for all the points in that diagram. And given our computational limit capabilities, it's really impossible to do that. So what we did is to choose only 16 regions, 16 points in that diagram, and do a better statistics for those 16 points in that diagram to determine the behavior, to determine this distribution of lifetimes. So that's what we did here. So we took the diagram, took 16 points in the diagram, and ran lots of simulations for each one of these gene points using thousands of initial conditions for each point. And then we determined the distribution of lifetimes. So this curve here is the histogram of lifetimes for all the simulations that we did for this particular network configuration. H equals 2, which is 4 modules, 60% regular, 20% chattering, 20% LTS. We did this for all possible combinations. H equals 0, 1, and 2, and 60% RS, 20% CH, 40% RX, 40% CH, 20% LTS, 20% FS, all the combinations that one can find, and we obtained the lifetime distributions here. And one can see, I don't know if you can see, but the ones in the upper right corner of this weaker synaptic strength diagram are the ones that last longer. And they have a sort of exponential decay, meaning that they're really transient. But they last longer. They last for, say, times could go up to 10,000 milliseconds. So this really suggests that if you are in this range, in this area of the parameter space, you're favoring the existence of long-lived oscillatory self-sustained activity. Okay, these are the same log plots for these 9 distributions there. But we did, say, to really show this to you, it's better to show for all possible architectures. It's not only for a given case, a single case, as I'm showing here. So for all possible combinations, so excitatory neurons only of the regular spiking type with LTS inhibitory neurons or FS. So, and 20% chattering, 60% regular type, and LTS or FS, and all the combinations. What one can see here, and here are the medians. We're also using the medians to characterize the lifetime of self-sustained activity. One can see that, again, self-sustained activity is favored by modularity. So if you increase, even if you are in say, a random network, so only regular spiking neuron, Nerdos-Renyi type of or random network. So single, 0, H equals 0, 1 module. All of the excitatory neurons are regular, and the inhibitor are LTS. You have the median of a given value for the different points there. We took only 4 points. We took only those 4 points here in the upper right corner. Should have said that. If we increase the modularity, you increase the median in general, in all cases. So if you are in a mixture type, mixture of 2 different types of excitatory neurons, again, if you increase the modularity, you always increase the medians. Slightly less if the excitatory neurons are intrinsically bursting than chattering. So again, modularity favors the existence of long-lived self-sustained activities. Sorry, yeah. Yeah. The percentage of excitation is always fixed in 80% and the inhibitor 20%. But within the 80%, we change the percentages of RS and the second type. Say 20% or 40%. We did also studies with, say, different percentages, but here we show only 20 and 40%. Another characteristic is that, again, as I said in the preliminary result, again, if the second type of excitatory neuron is chattering, you also favor the existence of self-sustained activity. So, and again, and also if the inhibitory neuron is of the LTS type, if you look here and there, if you compare, you see that the figures here are larger, slightly larger or larger than the figures there. So the basic message is that what favors self-sustained activity is modularity, but let me say, considering the excitatory neurons, regular spiking plus chattering, which means a type of neuron that spike regularly and a type of neuron that spike in bursts, fast repetitive bursts, and inhibitory neurons of the low threshold spiking time. As far as, so yeah. Oh no, as far as I know, this is the first time that it's shown that a combination of topology plus intrinsic characteristics of neurons influences the existence of sustained activity in a model. People like Brunel and others have shown the effect of topology, basically random networks with different P's, and using the balance mechanism. By the way, that balancing mechanism is also present here because we have larger inhibitory strengths than excitatory strengths. So that balance, that classical balance mechanism that I talked in the beginning is still, say, present here, underlying all these simulations. But we're showing it's beyond that. We're showing that there's additional mechanisms that favor sustainability, or the existence of sustained activity, sustained states in the brain, which are combinations that act in a synergistic way between topology and dynamical individualities, if you want. Since there's no distance here, is everything instantaneous? They are all collapsing in a single point. So there's no notion of distance here. Of space. So all the neurons in this network are. One can add, since one has modules, one can define that, say modules at hierarchical level, the first hierarchical level are closer together than modules at the second hierarchical level, and so on, and introduce by hand some notion of distance or time. But we didn't do that. These are things for further works. Yeah, but this is just to study the effect of modularity. Could be that in a different module, one has different types of neurons, but at least it's shown that considering the existence of neurons of different personalities, of different dynamic characteristics is important. One cannot neglect and use, say, simple integrated fire neurons. I think this is the main message of this part of the work. So, this is basically what I said is what is written there, so I don't need to. It's important, the composition and the topology, as well as the balance. And how can one envisage the mechanism whereby modularity favors the existence of self-sustained activity? Perhaps this has to do with bags and plane, because if you have different moduli, I keep saying moduli, in the network, if you concentrate on any given module, a given module is like a random network, but with a denser connectivity than the initial one. And according to the classic mechanism that I presented to you, if you have a module or a network, a random network with a large density of connections, this is not sparse, and this is incapable to generate sustained activity. So each individual module, because they get denser as one create more modules, they lose the capability of sustained activity. But the modules are connected to other modules. So if you imagine that each module has an activity which is transient, but because of the connections, before it dies out, or in some cases they can die out without propagating the information. But in some cases, the activity in a module die out, but because of the couplings with the other modules, they transmit information to other modules and they keep the other modules alive. And this may generate a kind of itinerant or alternative sequence of states in which you have one module active and then another module and then another module and so on. Sometimes you can have 2 or 3 modules active, but because of the coupling between them, they generate a sequence of activities that propagate from module to module, and this enhances the probability of having a self-sustained activity in the entire network. So this is a possible explanation for why one has why modularity favors. And also, it's not there, but I can advance to you a possible explanation for why chattering neurons would be interesting for self-sustained activity. Also because they are more or less kind of the same idea. They have those bursts. So the bursts have the tendency to strongly influence the postsynaptic neurons, to chattering neurons. And not only this, but they tend to try to coordinate the generic activity of the network. They tend to synchronize neurons. In general, when you have bursting neurons in a network, the bursting neurons tend to act like synchronizers. They sort of synchronize the neurons. This could generate the synchronized oscillations that we're observing, but also since the activity is synchronized and coordinated, neurons before dying out can, send bursts. A chattering neuron, for example, before dying out, they can send bursts to all the neurons, all the postsynaptic neurons. And since they are bursts, there are many spikes, they have this capability of activating the postsynaptic neurons and preventing fast convergence to a resting state for the entire network. Because somewhere in the network, there's a bursting neuron that sends bursts to another neuron. So while everybody's falling asleep, a person who keeps bursting there stimulates another one, and this keeps the entire activity alive, so to speak. More or less, this is the argument. Regarding irregularity, I'm really talking too much, but also it's your fault. You did a lot of questions, but no problem. It shows that the subject is interesting. So I'm really, and this is the first time I'm giving this talk. So regarding the irregularity, because we must not only show that the network generates self-sustained activity, but also generates irregular behavior, which is similar to the ones that are observed, to the one which is observed experimentally. And again, this is just an instance for this network with, 4 modules, excitatory neurons exclusively of the regular type, inhibitory neurons of LTS, and in this point in parameter space. Again, one has that oscillatory sustained activity. We did frequency analysis using FFT in this network to see the dominant global frequencies, and see that the dominant global frequencies are low, which is good news. The firing rates have a distribution which look like the experimentally observed ones, with means that are not too high, in the 20s, and they're non-Gaussian. They are relatively broad, as expected. The distribution of interspike intervals also have that exponential behavior, typically of a Poissonian behavior, with coefficient of variations which are large. And the distribution of the CVs for the neurons, they're also broad, and they have values, well, in this graph here, there's no, the mean, as one can see here, they're close or above 1, which is also good because the CV for a Poissonian process is just 1. The coefficient of variation of the interspike intervals, of the distribution of the interspike intervals, which is the standard deviation by the mean. So for a Poissonian process, the CV is equal to 1. If you have a Poissonian process, the standard deviation divided by the mean is 1. So if you have something equal to, whose CV is about 1 or larger than 1, you have a Poissonian-like system, or noisy-like system, if you want. Here's another example for a different architecture. This is only 2 modules, doesn't need blah, 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 but it's a different network, but again, the generic features are similar, more or less the same firing rates, the same interspike interval distribution, the same type of CV distribution. So we got this for all possible networks that we had. So we can argue that the network activity generated by us in all different models that we can generate with different values of H, different composition, is irregular. The distribution of neuron firing rates is asymmetrical, which is non-Gaussian and long-tailed, as expected. The interspike interval distribution is close to exponential, as expected. for a nearly Poissonian behavior. The distribution of CVs is broad and have average values, say, of the above or equal to 1. So all these features were observed in all self-sustained activity states in the diagram of low synaptic strength. So in all the situations in which we observed SSA states, we were mostly concentrating in this area. For all different network configurations with different modularity levels, different compositions, the characteristics that represent the activity which are usually measured by experimentalists, which are those here, they all point to an irregular spike in behavior, which is similar. So low frequencies, broad distributions of firing rates, broad distributions of CVs, all those measures that the people, experimentalists, do. So it's interesting because going back some slides, I mean, we are talking about a chaotic state, a chaotic regime that exists during a short time. This time could be short or could be long. One doesn't know, and we cannot predict for how long this chaotic regime will last. But the thing is that you have a network, and then you somewhat stimulate it using external stimulus, and then you awaken it, and then you let it evolve freely, and for some time, it is in this chaotic regime. All the trajectories for different networks are chaotic, but all of them share the same features, the same statistics. All of them have spiking characteristics which are more or less the same. As if, say, in this high-dimensional space that you have in these models, because they are really high-dimensional, during this short time, this transient time, the system is channeled to this low-dimensional region of phase space, low-dimensional, say, chaotic state, in which they lie for a given time, and then after that they escape. They go back to the, say, wherever in this high-dimensional space. So this is more or less the picture that one can construct of the behavior of these networks when they are, say, displaying a self-sustained activity. They are, say, trapped in this low-dimensional chaotic state for a while. This is interesting because this is consistent with conjectures that are really old, they're really classic, that argue that the default state of the brain is chaotic. The ones here who know about Walter Freeman or people like him who have been claiming this for 50 years now, or 40 years, 50 years, would recognize that the idea is more or less the same. That the brain is this default, this resting state. We're talking about the resting state. State in the absence of any external stimuli. This is chaotic, and the duration of this chaotic state is transient because, of course, all dynamic states in the brain are transient. We're all going to die sometime. No? But some dynamic characteristics of the brain can be captured by this model in this regime, in this, say, chaotic regime, which can be, by the way, altered with interaction with the environment, via the interaction with the environment, which is not modeled here. This is another step in this type of model. To use this model and add some external stimulation to represent stimuli or whatever you want, and see how the current ongoing state of brain influences the response of the network to this external stimuli. The current chaotic state of the brain influences the state of the evoked state. And of course, as I said before, the probability of the transient or the duration of the self-sustained activity depends on network, on the hierarchical level of the network, which is modularity, the mixture of excitatory inhibitory neurons, which is the combination of excitatory and inhibitory, and of course on the synaptic parameters, which is the balanced state. So it's necessary to have inhibitory synapses stronger than excitatory synapses, which is the classic argument that I mentioned at the beginning, the argument that Sompolinsky and Van Vreeswijk and Brunel and so on. So what we are adding here is some additional mechanisms that favor self-sustained activity in the brain. And of course, the duration of self-sustained activity can be prolonged if you increase the size of the network. A network of 1,000 neurons is too small. One can have larger networks and see if the effects preserved and if the duration can last longer. And preliminary results that we have done with larger networks show that this indeed happens. So it's good news. If you have larger brains, you have more likelihood of having self-sustained activity for longer periods. So you can idle in your, say, daydreaming or your thoughts without any necessity of accessing or having influence from the external environment, and stay in that state for having your hallucinations, if you want, for any time you want, if you have a big brain. So that's it. This is the group that has worked in that paper that I mentioned. This is part of this international collaboration involving the state of São Paulo in Brazil and Germany, basically Berlin area. So this work done by me, by Rodrigo, who is a PhD student of mine, and Misha Sachs from Humboldt University in Berlin, and his PhD student Peter Tomov, and it's funded by FAPESP and the AFG, and involves those universities. That's it.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions.
I have a simple question about the Izhikevich model.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah, Izhikevich, yeah.
Yeah. So it's clear that it's capable of generating really complex behavior and everything, but in that first plot of complexity against efficiency or something like that, he claimed that his model had like 13 biological features, I think. And I didn't quite understand that, since his equations are so simple, and where did these features come from?
Yeah, for me, the only feature that matters is the capability of reproducing spiking behavior. So if you consider, say, adaptability or tonic firing, regular firing feature, then you can have as up as 30. But if you go to different features that neurons have, like dendritic processing or really important features, this kind of model, bullshit. They don't model that. So, so that's the main key. If you are interested, say, in using, say, a better model than integrate and fire, which, say, displays some firing regimes which are observed in the brain, you can use this. But if you really want to do, say, a good brain model, you have to go beyond that. You have to, say, use what we call realistic model, or more biophysically realistic model.
All right.
And then you go to blue brain or those Macron things. Yeah.
I have a comment in the other direction. So even though you don't have space or a notion of distance, the way you describe how this phenomenon emerges looks to me like the description of a traveling wave. So if that's true, then there are simpler ways of getting traveling waves, like in reaction diffusion processes or in the heart. So what do you have to comment?
Yeah, you have simpler mechanisms that can generate propagating behavior. The thing is that we have, if we want to do a cortical model, we're constrained to generate, say, traveling waves that generate, say, firing statistics which are similar to the ones observed in the brain. So one can have a self-sustained activity in that epileptic state, very high firing rates, for example. But this is unrealistic. So you need to have some constraints on your model. So even if you want to model heart, you have the traveling waves, but then you have some constraints corresponding to the heart model. To the brain, you have your own constraints. So one can try to, like people like Bart Ehrmantraut in the 60s, they did traveling wave models to model hallucinations in they use even field models, so neural models in which there's no, say, point neurons. You have just a field where activity propagates. People now are coming back to those old models, people like Ingo Bojack and so on. This can, say, can be constrained to model a certain feature of the brain in a much simpler way than, say, simulating single neurons and so on. It depends on your question, depends on what you want to model. If you just want, say, to show that it's possible to have traveling waves or traveling activity from region to region in a brain-like structure, you can do a much simpler model than this one. Like I said, people like Amari, people like those guys from the 60s, I don't remember all of them now, but those guys did models, very simple models, in which they could show that. But I mean, we are at a different stage in, say, history of computational neuroscience. We're now trying to use, say, single models to put them together. And see if with those models one can generate behaviors that were observed with simpler models, but in a more realistic way. We can talk about more about that.
So yeah, let's thank Antonio again.